action. European slave traders built 3 slave castles in West Africa. And other 3 slave castles European slave traders built in West Africa are located in Ghana. Basic slave castles are Elmina Slave Castle, Osu Slave Castle, and Cape Slave Castle. The Portuguese built Elmina Castle in 1482. The Danes established Osu Castle in 1661, and the British erected Cape Slave Castle in 1664. So that stands to reason that Cape Slave Castle is the youngest slave castle. However, Cape Slave Castle, which is the youngest, is 358 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, today's experience is going to be from the Afrocentric perspective. There are 2 dungeons here at Cape Slave Castle, the male dungeon and the female slave dungeon. In the male slave dungeon were as many as 1,000 enslaved African men. In the female dungeon were as many as 500 enslaved African women. So the totality being held in both dungeons was 1,500 enslaved African people. But we need to know the genesis of the transatlantic slave trade. What actually triggered the Europeans to come to West Africa? What brought them here? Now, before the Europeans came here, the first intruders to come to this beautiful region were the Arabs. But the Arabs came across a desert we call the Sahara Desert. They came for gold, ivory, spices, and many Africans to the Middle East. However, all the Arabs, merchants, were actually castrating all the African men they took to the Middle East because they didn't want black people to produce over there. That's the major reason why today we have African Americans, we have black Europeans, we have Caribbeans coming to see where the ancestors were taken from. We don't know where the black Arabs are, because many African men believe them in that painful experience until they died. It was around that same time that the Arab slave traders were trading with the Europeans. They were giving the Europeans the gold, they were stealing from the Africans. But it got to a point where the Europeans wanted to know where the Arabs were getting the gold from. And the first Europeans to come here were the Portuguese. But the Portuguese got to a place called Cape Verde. They didn't find enough gold. So they kept navigating and eventually got to Ghana in 1471. It was around 1482 that the Portuguese built Elmina Slave Castle. Now, the major difference between Cape Slave Castle and Elmina Slave Castle is that Elmina Castle was not built for the transatlantic genocide, but Cape Slave Castle was built for the transatlantic genocide. Now, when the Portuguese got there, they built storages, not dungeons. The storages were meant to store the gold the Portuguese were stealing from the Africans. So it was after Christopher Columbus claimed he discovered the Americas in 1482. So look, Elmina Castle was built in 1482, but Christopher Columbus claimed he discovered the Americas in 1492. So when that part of the world was discovered, the Europeans realized that they could cultivate sugarcane to produce sugar. Sugar was very expensive. So the Europeans named sugar white gold. But before the Europeans came here for West Africans to the Americans, they were already urging the Native Americans as cheap labors. But due to the fact that the Europeans introduced many diseases that killed the Native Americans, there was a priest from Spain, a Catholic priest called Bartolomeo de las Casas. He recommended that the Europeans should rather come for West Africans to the Americans, that the West Africans are very strong people. And that marked the genesis of the transatlantic genocide, massacre, and destruction. There was no trade, there was genocide, massacre, and destruction. But because the history has been watered down by the Europeans, they classify this as a trade and not a crime. But let's dive deep. Let me expatiate on this very carefully. You know, there are many historians who claim that the Africans sold their own people to the Europeans. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm not saying that the Africans were involved. But we need to know what actually brought the Africans being involved. What made the Africans bring their own people to the Europeans in order to get items such as clothing items, gunpowder, heroes, sugar. Now, when you look at the map, this is an imaginary map of West Africa. Okay? Now, this is where the slave castles are located. This is the ocean. Okay, Mali, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire. Now, during the slave trade era, our ancestors did not have the kind of geopolitical that we have today. They didn't have the present day Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, Senegal, Burkina Faso. No, they had what you call the empires, kingdoms, chiefdoms, and different tribes who spoke different languages. So different tribes were already fighting against each other over resources such as land and gold. But our ancestors were still not practicing slavery. They were practicing what you call servitude. There's a difference between servitude and slavery. Like in servitude, servants could keep their names, they could marry, they could have children, they could even inherit the properties of their masters. They could even marry the daughters of their masters. But when the Europeans came, remember this, European culture focuses on three major things: product, privilege, and power. African culture focuses on three things: mutual relationship, respect, and values. Now when you take product, privilege, and power, what you get from these three things I just made mention of is white supremacy, indoctrination, mass incarceration, and weapons of mass destruction. We'll come to that when you get to the residence and to the church of the British government. So when the Europeans came from the beginning, they were practicing what you call violent aggression. They themselves were kidnapping the Africans along the West Africa. But because the West Africans were defending themselves, the European slave traders realized that it wasn't easy for them to penetrate. So they began employing into the system weapons of mass destruction. They began giving these weapons to the chiefs, leaders, tribes in West Africa in the name of causing confusion amongst the Africans. There were many tribes, leaders, chiefs who refused to obtain the gun and gunpowder from the Europeans. But the point was that how effectively do you protect your people without these weapons? Somebody who has these weapons will come and kill you and take over your jurisdiction. So that brought confusion, a massive confusion. Everybody was fighting. But the conditions Europeans gave to our people is for them to bring them peace. And they owed the act. And this nearly lasted nearly 500 years. Many Africans were brought here geographically, were not even from Ghana. Some of them came from Mali, Burkina Faso, they walked there. Now where we are right now is a place called the Palava Hall. This was the auction hall. Palava is a Portuguese word which means to negotiate or to bargain. This is where the transaction actually took place. There were many tables here, but that table and the chairs are all recent ones. On the tables with items such as clothing items, gunpowder, mirrors, sugar, and many more. So the African slave traders would bring the enslaved Africans here to the British traders for transaction to take place. So the British traders would ask the African slave traders what they wanted on the table. I want this, I want that. They'll negotiate, take the enslaved Africans from them. For easy identification, the British traders had iron. We call it branded iron. On the branded iron were the names, the initials of the buyers. We just put it in fire, put it on the chest, the arm, or the back of the enslaved Africans for easy identification. And right after that, the African men were taken to the male slave dungeon, and the African women to the female slave dungeon for shipment to begin to the Americas. Ladies and gentlemen, something horrible was already happening. There were insurance companies who were selling insurance policies to the slave owners. And I know two of them, New York Life Insurance Company and US Life Insurance Company. So they sold insurance policies to the slave owners. When a slave dies, these insurance companies will compensate the slaves, the slave owners. So the slave owners, they see the Africans as people. Remember, they focus on the money, product, privilege, and power. It's a very frequent transaction. Let me know if you have questions before the talking goes. You saw the cannonballs and the cannons.
Yeah.
Weapons of mass destruction. There's a church on top of the male dungeon. In the male dungeon were 1,000 men. Mass incarceration. The church on top of the male dungeon represents indoctrination. And the residents above everything, the residents of the British government represent white supremacy. In the process, I'm going to expatiate on the things that I did mention of. Okay, please come.